Gary's probably waiting on his tire getting
Good evening, everyone. Can I have your attention, please? Welcome, everybody, to the 63rd Annual Hard Winter Wheat Tour. My name is, I'm glad to see everybody face to face. Really great that we could get this done. We delayed the tour a couple of weeks, and I think that paid off in this case. So glad to see a room full of people. My name is Aaron Harries. I'm Vice President of Research and Operations for Kansas Wheat here in Manhattan. I'll be your MC the next few nights and walk you through the tour. Got Dave Green with the Wheat Quality Council who put this all together, and we'll have some presentations and orientation for you this evening. We are also live streaming the event every night. So this little camera on here is great technology. It's supposed to follow voices. So keep your side conversations down while we're doing presentations, and hopefully it'll stay up to the front of the room, but we won't guarantee anything. So again, glad to have you all here. The program tonight, we've got presentations from a couple of people with K-State. We'll walk you through orientation on the wheat tour. Most of you, I believe in here, have been on a wheat tour before. Just a show of hands, how many of you, is this your first tour? Oh, okay. I've never been more wrong. Okay, well, it's still a good teacher to student ratio this year. There are a lot of experienced people on this tour who've been around, a lot of people will learn from, and we've got a lot of different things we're going to see this year. So how we start every evening when we gather together before we give our reports is going around the room and introducing ourselves, because when we gather in Colby and Wichita the next 2 nights, we'll have some guests, farmers from the local area, and we want to introduce ourselves. So just please stand up, say your name, your company, and where you're from. And we'll start on my left, right here, Clay.
Clay Patton, market anchor and ag reporter for KRVN Radio. That's our flagship in the rural radio network based in Lexington, Nebraska.
Andrew Blueball with Westbred out Burton, Kansas.
Tom Jenkinson, RFD TV and Rural Radio Channel 147 from Nashville.
Julie Engelson with Reuters out of Chicago, obviously facing the wrong way.
Good evening, Matt Wildy with DTN Progressive Farmer. I'm based out of my house in Ankeny, Iowa.
Hi, I'm Chris Kirby with Oklahoma Wheat Commission based out of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma.
I'm William Bonder. I'm with Anderson's Trade Group out of Kansas City, Missouri.
My name is Levi Hall. I'm the grain division manager for a cooperative, Horizon Resources, up in northwest North Dakota, Williston, North Dakota.
Amy Heesh, CHS Hedging, Emigo Heights.
Rita Ott with General Mills in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Josh Graves, RJ O'Brien, based out of Chicago.
Josh Longton, Miller Milling, and the Twin Cities.
Ryan Pace, commodity manager, Inspired Brands out of Atlanta.
Steve Orlick, Inspire Brands, Senior Director of Commodities and Analytics, Atlanta.
I'm Sam Lauerbeck. I'm a commodity management analyst at Inspire Brands in Atlanta.
Steve, and this is probably a good time. Inspire Brands doesn't snap into people's heads, but I keep thinking of Dunkin' Donuts and go through the list of companies that we're talking about that he represents.
So Inspire Brands, the #2 largest restaurant company in the country right now. So we have Buffalo Wild Wings, Sonic, Arby's, Jimmy John's, Rusty Taco, Baskin Robbins, and Dunkin' Donuts, and we're still growing. So thank you everyone for having us, and we're really excited about the tour.
Thank you.
Tim Ashburner, Grain-Craft out of Wichita, Kansas.
Max Riemann, Grain-Craft, Kansas City, Kansas.
Lisa Shem, I'm a guest for tonight.
David Sham, Ag Advisor for Senator Roger Marshall, and I work out of my farm in Cherry Springs, Kansas.
Sarah Aronson with the Nebraska Wheat Board out of Lincoln, Nebraska.
Taylor Williamson, I'm a Kansas wheat based out of here in Manhattan.
Josh Reesner, 80, I'm Milling, based out of Kansas City.
Brian Walker, Miller Milling, Minneapolis.
Eddie Tapa, Miller Milling, Saginaw, Texas.
Rich Kendrick, Great Plains Analytical Lab, Kansas City.
Van Flam, Ardent Mills, Overland Park, Kansas.
Go ahead, Marshall.
Marsha Boswell, Kansas City, Manhattan, Kansas.
Hey everyone, I'm Kelsey Anderson, an O3 extension plant pathologist with Kansas State.
Evan Barker, Secure Field Ingredients, Commodity Manager, Russell, Kansas.
Brent Schaffner, Healthy Food Ingredients, Watertown, South Dakota.
Colin Pierce, Healthy Food Ingredients, Watertown.
Ann Osborne, National Wheat Foundation from Jamestown, North Dakota.
Wade Hofftower, Food Corporation Development Manager, Food and Beverage. Mike McGraw, Food Key, out of Kansas City.
Fraser Egan with Corbion Ingredients out of Overland Park, Kansas. Sean Company out of Overland Park with Corbion.
Kevin Shipman, agriculture reporter, Bloomberg News, based out of Chicago, originally from Tennessee.
Marty Draper, Kansas State University College of Agriculture, KSRE Extension.
Marty Denton, Ag-D, Kansas State University.
Hi everyone, I'm Romulo Lolato, Extension Wheat and Forest Specialist with Kansas State University.
And I'm Dave Green with the Wheat Quality Council in Kansas City.
We get everybody. Good diverse group as usual. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being here, Dean Minton. Great to have K-State representation on the tour again.
We're so desperate to get off
I know.
It's gonna be a great couple days out of it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of housekeeping and mandates and things like that, the mask mandate in Manhattan expired last night. So I think everywhere we're going except Wichita does not have a mask mandate. They are going to ask us to wear masks in the hotel at Wichita unless something changes between now and then. I think that's the only place we're likely to run into that. So hopefully everybody has gotten through this safe and healthy and the end is in sight here. So other housekeeping tonight, the bar is open if you got your tickets from Dave. We'll serve dinner right here where you're sitting. We'll have a buffet line set up. The restrooms are back down the hall to your right down here if you need those. Hopefully you picked up a book, a yardstick, your coupons when you walked in. I'll talk about the weather forecast here in a little bit. I think we may end up being lucky a little bit this year on the weather forecast. But we'll jump right into it. If you're going to be on the Twitter thing during the tour, please use hashtag WheatTour21. Tag your tweets so we can, and if you want to copy at Kansas Wheat on that, we'd appreciate that too. Here is the routes for the tour. Most of you are familiar with these, but Dave will give us kind of assignments on our different routes and how we're going around the state. And we'll have reporting by the color of the routes each evening when we get done for the day. As far as the weather conditions, I think tomorrow will be okay. There might be some scattered rain and storms around 1 o'clock or later as you head towards northwest Kansas. The temps for most of the day should be in the 60s. You're going to find mud the entire route along that way. There's no doubt about that. Even the drier locations in north central Kansas here have seen pretty substantial rain. Those of you on the green route are going to see some hail damage up in that part of the state, unfortunately, and that's not the only place you're going to see a little bit of hail damage. When we go into Wednesday, again, I think we're probably going to be okay for most of the day. There is a chance of storms after 1 p.m. Temperatures will be mostly in the 70s, especially in the afternoon, so it could be a nice day. And then Thursday morning might be a little bit wet for those of you going from Wichita on the way to Manhattan. Don't expect any severe weather. So sorry for those of you wanting to do tornado chasing. That's probably not going to happen this year. And we have seen tornadoes on this tour before, from a distance, from a safe distance. Here are the rules. There aren't many rules on this tour. What you're going to do with your driver, and a lot of individual drivers this year, and we'll talk about routes and everything for the process a little bit later on. You're going to stop, your driver's going to watch the odometer and stop about every 20 or 30 miles, depending on the route, randomly at a field. And you're going to go in and do your evaluations of the wheat crop. If it's a fenced field, please stay out of it. Okay, there are a lot of open fields along your route. Don't cross a fence and get into a fenced field. We will see some thunderstorms. If it is lightning, please stay in your car. We don't need anybody out in the wide open if we've got a thunderstorm and it's lightning. If you can help your driver cover the cost of gas, please do so. And stop at the tourist attractions. Dave put the usual list inside your folders. Hold your drivers to that. Make sure they stop at some of those attractions so you can learn a little bit about Kansas. We'll have a stop in there, obviously, for lunch, and hopefully you can avoid the fast food situation. There are a few notable good restaurants along the way, and you'll have plenty of time to eat lunch. And you'll end up at Colby tomorrow night. The program starts at 6 o'clock, so you'll have plenty of time to get to Colby, check into the hotel, and make it in time for our reports. And then finally, place your bet. Every year, you take a business card or a piece of paper, put your name on it, and that final day, or if you leave Wednesday night, give it to Dave before you leave. You're going to put your estimate for the entire crop. How many bushels of wheat is going to be produced in Kansas? And submit that with a dollar bill if you choose to. That goes into a pot, and the closest, without going over, just the closest.
The closest wins the money and the tribute and the check and the prestige. So,
And usually it's a rookie.
who all has won the wheat tour? Guess it. 3 of us. So it's quite an honor. It's quite a prestigious group. So we expect everybody to make a guess, and we'll walk you through it when we get to Wichita. We'll talk to you about the harvested acres and what kind of number to put in, but we expect everybody to give a guess, and that'll be the average of those guesses will be the number we present to the trade as what the wheat tour cost.
There's no pressure this year. The USDA number is already out there. Yeah, there's a little bit of pressure, but the crop is a little bit further along, just a few days, I know, but most of the crop, half of the crop at least, is headed, which makes our evaluation a little bit easier, and we'll talk about the formulas here in a bit. So where is the wheat in Kansas? Those of you not familiar with the state or the first time on the tour, this is cropland data layer map from USDA Ag Statistics. Red button is where we are right now in Manhattan. This pin is Colby, Kansas, and this pin is Wichita, Kansas. Every brown dot there represents essentially a field of wheat. So we're not quite into wheat country here. You have to go west out of town, so you won't see much wheat around here in Manhattan, but it will really pick up as you go into the western part of the state. 7.3 million planted acres of wheat in Kansas this year, which is up a little bit from last year. And we'll see how the harvest plays out. This is an interesting map. This is also a cropland data layer map. The colors are going to be a little bit hard to see here. But what you want to take a look at is yellow is corn, green is soybeans, and this brown color is winter wheat. Take a look at all the yellow in northwest Kansas. That's irrigated corn. And I'm going to show you a map from just 2012. So keep your eye right here on Sheridan County, and let's flip it to 2012. See how much more brown is in Sheridan and Thomas County in 2012 versus 2020. Pretty phenomenal increase in corn acres and decrease in wheat acres. Look here in Stafford County, see all this red? That's cotton. 2012, not much cotton. There's a gin down there now. So those cotton acres probably take away from wheat acres. You'll notice 2020, how much corn and soybeans have moved into the central part of the state. A little bit more brown in 2012. So you can kind of see the trend there about that corn and soybean line moving further west. But at the same time, our farmers have really done a good job of producing wheat in Kansas. If our yield per acre is 48 bushels an acre this year, as predicted by USDA, the past 7 years, our average bushels per acre in Kansas is 48 bushels per acre. The 6 years prior to that, it was 38 bushels an acre. So we've really reached a new yield plateau. You've got to credit weather a little bit for that, obviously. But the fewer acres we get in Kansas, the more intensely managed our farmers seem to be doing on our wheat acres. And Romulo will explain a little bit about that. So this is the latest crop progress condition report that came out about 3 o'clock this afternoon. You're going to notice the soil moisture situation has changed dramatically, and 71% adequate soil moisture in most of the state. That's a night and day difference. There are still a few very dry spots actually south of Wichita. They didn't get any rain the last 2 nights, but that's still in the forecast for them. And the percentage of good to excellent wheat went up 1 point in Kansas from last week. We went from 53% good to excellent to 54% good to excellent. So what's unique about this specific week in Kansas in May, and this is my opinion, we're going to see the wheat at its maximum potential this week. I mean, there's not much that can happen from this point forward that will make the crop get bigger. It's probably going to get smaller if anything. So it's going to be a great week for us to evaluate this, and I think we're going to see some pretty good things out there. So you'll have these reporting sheets in your folders, or at least the drivers will. I won't get too much into detail on these. There's just several parts in here you want to take a look at. You're going to measure the height, and then these are the formulas that we're going to pay attention to. There's different formulas for the eastern, central, and western third of the state based on county breakdown by crop district. Again, if you're someone experienced or with someone experienced, they're going to know how to do this. We're going to use probably the late season formula in most fields that we see. If you can get a good count on the tillers and the heads, you can use the late season formula, which gets us a better number. And that's the formula down there. So once you get out there, your first stop, your first 2 stops, it'll be old hat to you. You'll be able to get this down right away. The real sophisticated people have it in a spreadsheet where you're ready to go. I'm not that sophisticated, and I'm not good at math. So whoever's riding with me is out of luck. Row spacing, you're going to see different row spacing across the state. That's a component of the formula. The row spacings you might see are 7.5, 10, 12. Maybe some 15 inches. The rows get farther apart the further west you get in Kansas. 12-inch rows are going to be more likely in western Kansas, and we're talking about the space from center of row to center of row. So a good way to do this is to lay your yardstick across 3 rows and put the mark on the center of the row, and that's going to tell you the width in between your rows. And that's tricky in some spots, but again, that has a huge impact on your formula and your calculation. The rows are further apart the further west you get because they get less rainfall out west, so they put fewer seeds per acre because they can't grow as much with the less water out there on normal years. Different growth stages of wheat we'll take a look at. I'm not going to spend time on that. Romulo is probably going to cover that. These are the crop districts I mentioned. So when you use the eastern third of the state, that formula, basically once you leave Manhattan, you're going to be in the central third of the state. So you use that central third, but just watch your county lines. When you move into these western 3 districts, that's when you use the formula for the western third of the state. And these formulas have been calculated for us by Kansas Ag Statistics. Doug Bounds, who couldn't be on the tour, but he provides those calculations to Dave, and those are based on previous years, and that's kind of a accruing data for the formula. And this is what that formula is. I think we'll save this to go through it later. But we will use the late season formula. So you'll be able to count heads or tillers that you know are going to have heads on them in most places. There might be some places in north central, northwest Kansas where you might have to count tillers. And then you're going to use that early season formula because you won't be able to count the heads on those. And then this is the USDA prediction that came out last week. They forecast a crop at 331 million bushels in Kansas, which is up 18% from last year. And that would be a yield forecast of 48 bushels per acre. That crop of around 331 million bushels, I think, is right at our 5-year average in Kansas, around 330 million bushels. So that would be about an average crop, slightly above average crop. I would take the over on that number as of today, probably, maybe way over. Okay, any questions We're going to get into a lot more detail here, but that's just a general overview of the tour. We'll explain all the driving situation and routes here. Dave, did you want to take a couple minutes to talk about history of the tour for the
Yeah,
new
so
folks
if you're
here?
not familiar, these tours go back to the 1960s. And basically, they were originally designed through the Wheat Quality Council to kind of bring the buyers, the bakery buyers out once a year and show them the new farm machinery and the new wheat varieties that were being grown and how production agriculture was changing. So these buyers would get on the train from New York and Chicago and come down here to Kansas, typically to Wichita. They take them out in the fields and show them what wheat looked like and what was going on. In the 60s, when this started, nobody was really serious about commodities. The government was involved, there were price supports, there was restricted acreage. It wasn't until the Russians started buying grain in the 70s that all of a sudden people were more interested in supply and what it was going to affect the market. So starting in the 70s, all of a sudden this became, by happenstance, the only tour that invited bakers and millers out into the wheat fields. And we kind of formalized over time the way we were doing things. So it wasn't as much, as I used to say, a 3-day drunk, out looking at wheat fields. It now turned into something that was serious, and people started asking about when's this crop going to get harvested? How big is it? What's the protein content going to be? What diseases do we need to worry about? And so we started to formalize the tour over time, and it's been a gradual thing to the form it is now, which is we switch riders as much as possible. We follow the same routes. We use the same yield formulas. So we try to do as good a job now, knowing the limitations of the group that were, you saw how many hands, this is their first time, but trying to do as good a job taking a snapshot of the crop as possible. So that's kind of the history of what's happened on this tour.
All right. We'll get into Wheat 101 right now. I've got Romulo and Kelsey are going to tag team us on what we're going to look for this year. Romulo's going to talk about the crop to this point in time. There's a lot of disease issues we're going to see out there, a lot of other factors. So Romulo, come on up and we'll turn it over to you.
All right. Marshall, do you put it in?
Aaron. Yeah, it's on the desktop. We should be able to just go slideshow.
All righty. Okay, well, good evening, folks. It's good to see everyone here, and good to be, as Aaron mentioned, good to be face to face again. So just keep in mind as I'm going through this presentation that Aaron mentioned that is everybody's here 2 or 3 times already on the tour, right? So didn't need to, I think you got that one kind of wrong, but hopefully we get the final number right, so that would be good. And okay, folks, so briefly what I want to do here today, just want to cover a couple of things. One, whenever we are out in the field, how do we actually ID the different growth stages of wheat, thinking of where the crop is right now and what to look for. And then what have been the conditions of the wheat crop in Kansas so far. So more or less, what can we expect from the crop going out this year? So wheat growth stage ID, where are we in terms of development, right? If we think of winter wheat here in Kansas, it's going to be planted in the fall. So right there, sometime September or October, that's when planting is going to happen. Aaron showed a lot of corn area. There's quite a bit of soybeans in the center as well. That can push planting dates all the way to November, but that's when the crop's typically planted. It's going to go through the winter where it needs to meet some requirements for that plant, right? The plant has some requirements of cold temperature. So it needs about 6 to 8 weeks of soil temperatures below about 50 Fahrenheit. And then it kicks in, goes from the vegetative tillering stage to the reproductive. So it starts to go through what we call stem elongation. And that head, the wheat head, starts to develop right there in the crown, right underneath the soil. It starts to develop there, it starts to move up the stem, to be pushed up the stem, all the way through boot and head in here, when we start to see the heads coming out. That's usually sometime in May, depending where we are in the state. And then harvest there Again, depends. South central Kansas might be as early as early June. We move to northwest Kansas, might be as late as early July. So that's more or less when we should expect things to happen in a normal year in Kansas. Now, what about this year? So this map here shows a wheat growth stage model that we have in K-State that we developed in the last few years here. That's just based on temperature, right? How many growing degree days we accumulated, the crop accumulated, and what's the window of development that the crop is going to be simply based on temperature, how much temperature we have had in the season. And the different colors here give us the different developmental windows where the crop might be. So really we have 3 shades of green there. It tells us that the crop might be anywhere from that flag leaf emergence, where that last flag leaf is the last one, where the last leaves coming out of the row, out of the boot of the crop. That's very important because that leaf is going to be responsible for a lot of the sugars being produced in the plant and going into the grain. That makes starch, and starch gives us our best weight and gives yield as well. And that will be more in the northwest part of the state. As we move towards central Kansas, the crop's mostly going to be between boot and heading, right? So the flag leaf's fully out. Boot, I'm going to show some pictures, but that's when the head is coming up the stem, and we can feel it because it's a little bit like fat like this in the last internode. So that means that the head's about to come out of the stem. And then as we go to south central Kansas and into the southeast portion of the state where it's warmer, then for sure we're going to see some grain filling already. We had there from heading to flowering, but I was there last week. We're seeing a little bit of grain development already. So let's see how this looks in the field, right? If we are in that very far part of the northwest corner of the state, stem elongation is simply when that crop, the stem of the crop is being pushed up, right? In the beginning it's prostrate, and then in the spring starts to be pushed up and elongate. Now, the flag leaves, the very last leaf there, right? Whenever it's fully out, the only thing that is missing to come out of there is the head. So this is much easier to identify once we are out in the field. This is just a couple of pictures here for us to have an idea of what the crop might be looking like. A younger crop, a little bit more advanced crop here. Now we have different stages of development in these 2 pictures here. Anywhere from the boot stage. Now what you can notice here in the boot stage is that this last, what we call internode of the plant here, it's thickened up, right? And that's because the head is being pushed up there, and pretty soon it's going to be coming out of the stem there. And this is an early heading, and finally when the crop is fully headed out, right? So when you go in a field that is in this stage, you're going to have a mix there between some of the early peelers that are going to be already coming out. The head's going to be coming out of them. Some of the later developed peelers, they might be still at the boot stage. There's kind of a range. In parts of south central Kansas, we were there last week. We might be getting into some beginning of the grain filling stages. So whenever that kernel is being developed, right, the first thing that it does is after fertilization of that flower, it elongates. And by the time that it reaches the full length, it's quite watery. If you squeeze it between your fingers, it's really, really watery. So I doubt you're going to see much, or many fields are going to be past this. But anytime that we are kind of towards the late boot like this, through heading or early grain field, we can use that late season formula, which is probably a little bit more accurate than what we had in that early season formula. Just because we're close to maturity, have a better idea of what yields might be on that field. So that's more or less a range of the developmental stages that we're going to see out in the field this year. Now, going to the second part here, just like what has the crop been so far? What can we expect from the wheat crop as we're going out into these fields, right? And whenever we talk about the crop conditions, a couple of things that are very important: water and temperature, right? So how much moisture the crop has had so far, when did that moisture occur, and how much temperature it has had to develop as well. So let's review that a little bit. How has the season been so far? So remember that I mentioned that everything started in September, right? That's kind of like when the planting window starts. If you look at the month of September there, for the majority of the state, perhaps with a small exception, we had anywhere from 1.5 inches precipitation or more. So growers really took advantage of that. There was a large portion of the state that got planted in that mid to late September timeframe. kind of taking advantage of some of this precipitation that we had during the month of September there. Now, when we look at October, other than the southern fringe of the state, it was actually very dry. We look here, we had very, very small amounts of precipitation really throughout the state. If we compare this, it just shows us the amount, the total amount in October with the normal, that's what it looks like. So we see that for the entire state, we are negative. We accept, with the exception of perhaps this blue portion here, the southernmost tier of counties. So October was just dry. So what happened there? The crops that got planted in September came up well, had a good development in the fall. Most of the crop that got planted in October, except for that first southernmost part, it actually never emerged on time. It kind of was waiting on some precipitation to occur, right? The seed was put there, and many times it was just laying there because there was no moisture. It was not going to emerge. So then in November, we had, for the majority of the state, kind of a good amount of precipitation there. And so that crop that was planted in October but never really emerged on time, kind of making a little bit more headway into emergence there with that November precipitation. So that gives us, going into the winter, right, two very different crops. One that was kind of like planted in that September time frame, had a good amount of forage produced in the fall that we're looking at here, right? And the crop that got planted in October, sometimes after the grower was waiting for soybeans to be harvested, or as we go out west, was waiting on corn to be harvested and pushing that planting date late. October, really just, many of those fields just emerged in November. So really, whenever we were looking into a December amount of canopy out there, we had two very different crops. It's kind of especially true for that north central part of the state that I showed that was driest in the previous picture there. Well, that affects our yield, right? So if we look, what we're looking here very briefly, we have the planting date, and this is 5 years of research that was done by K-State. As we're delaying planting date, right? If you look at the blue line, which is the grain yield, you see that with delayed planting date, our yield goes down as well, right? Now, even though the crop was planted on time many times, mid-October, it never really emerged until November. So probably we're looking at a good, you know, see if the potential was close to 50. For those fields, you might be looking in probably a 15-20% reduction on there, just because it never really came up on time. So just keep that in mind. You might see fields in very different stages of development. Across the road, you might see something that is going through heading and flowering already, and then just a boot on the other side, those fields might have a pretty different yield potential. A couple of things that we were concerned during the season. One of them, if you're in Kansas in February, you probably got really cold, right? There were some stations in the state that got to -30 Fahrenheit. And so this, what this is showing here is the number of hours that the air temperatures were below 12 Fahrenheit. And we use 12 more or less as an indicator of like below that, the crop can suffer some injury. And if it's well below that, it can even go through winter kill and just like die during the winter. And you see that we had there 200 plus hours below 12, and some of those stations got to -30, which is really cold, can really has the potential to cause winter kill. And if we look at snowfall at that point in time, the snow is like a blanket for the crop, right? It protects the crop. We didn't have much. We had 1 to 2 inches only. So we were quite concerned at that point in time with the potential for winter kill. What was helping us was the soil temperatures. So we look at the soil temperatures here. If the soil temperatures are reaching the teens, like low teens and especially single digits, that's really, really concerning in terms of losing the crop through winter kill. Well, here we had a few low teens, but the soil temperatures overall they never reached single digits. So that was making us a little bit less concerned, but still there was the potential there. Afterwards, I mean, this is one example of a field around Salina, where the grower is reporting that this damage that we see here is from that February freeze, or not freeze, like from those really arctic temperatures that we had. So we see here that the crop lost a lot of leaves, right? It's still trying to recover, it's pushing up some stems there, but really with a reduced yield potential. So around that Salina area is where we had less snow cover. We almost didn't have any snow cover at that point in time. So there's some damage there that you guys might see, although it was less widespread than we were originally thinking. Another cold spell that we were concerned with was more recent in April. So now in April, about April 20th through the 22nd, the temperatures were not as cold, but the crop was further along. And so the crop is much more sensitive when it's further along in development. And between a combination there of the growth stage of the crop and how sensitive it was and how cold the temperatures actually were, we were estimating that we might see some freeze damage in that western band that you see there. Down south here, because the crop was further along and temperatures got pretty cold, and got reports from some growers in that region that they were seeing some freeze damage. And up north there, the crop was not as sensitive, but it got really cold. So that combination made us concerned, but so far seems like the crop might have escaped up there, but we are seeing kind of some freeze damage in the southern part of the state. What does that look like? And here's an example of what we're looking, if we're looking for freeze damage. You see there, and I see that the photo is not very good, but what we see is that wheat spike, instead of being all of those little spikelets, they look green and healthy. What they're looking like is just very twisted and white and essentially bleached out from that cold spell. If the crop is not further along, then we need to get a knife and split up the stem. That little developing head, it should look nice and firm and green, but if it's mushy and brown and like this, it's a pretty bad sign as well. As we move to northwest Kansas, we might have to split up the stems to find the heads. And then finally here, a couple more photos there. So last week we were finding quite a bit of these in south central part of the state. So you see that parts of this spike are completely gone there because of that cold spell. So this is what we're looking for whenever we're looking for any potential for freeze damage. And then finally, just for us to wrap up, if we look at the entire season, the amount of precipitation that we accumulated in season from 1st of September there all the way to today, right? May 17th. What we see there is we've had anywhere from about 6 to 8 inches in the northwest, southwest corner of the state, all the way to about 20 inches here, where the biggest wheat area kind of like starts to give air to other summer crops out there. And this is how it compares a percent of normal, right? So you see that for the majority of the state, with the exception of this blue area out here and in the central part of the state, we're still behind in terms of comparison to the normal. Here we're about 100%, 115% there. But where it's green and where it's yellow, we are in that 85 to 100%. So we're slightly behind. Hopefully, with the forecast that we have for this week, we catch up, and not only catch up, but go above what our normal is there. Up to last week, we were seeing some drought stress starting to develop. That's kind of what it looks like, the crop is drought stress. You're going to see a blue tint to it, and the leaves are going to start rolling up. This is just some very initial signs of drought stress. We're probably not going to see it now with the rain. The lower canopy starts to turn yellow. Then we're getting reports from the very far southwest corner of the state, around here, where some growers were starting, the crop was really starting to turn. And so that's actually drought stress as well. Some growers were talking in that far corner about abandonment as well. So something that we need to be on the watch out there. Again, forecast, Aaron already touched on that, but we have anywhere up to 2.5 inches there forecasted for the remainder of the state. So drought might not, we might not see many of those drought symptoms that I just showed you guys there. And if there's any area abandonment, that's kind of what it should more or less look like, right? If growers decided to abandon the crop, they're just gonna spray it out and plant a summer crop on top of that stand of wood that was there before. So of course, should be on the lookout as well, try to see how many abandoned fields we had compared to a normal there. Folks, that's a brief of what I had there for you guys today. My contact is there. I'll be on the tour as well. So always I'll be putting out tweets and everything. So feel free to follow me out there, ping me, tag me if you're in doubt on something that you're seeing. You know, and if I'm not driving, I'll make sure that I'll get back to you on that one as well. So.
And as usual, if you see something that's up, you don't know what it is, a bug you don't know what it is, a disease you don't know what it is, just bag it up, bring it in, don't tell us.
Yeah, definitely bring bring it to the meeting in the afternoon, and we can talk about it. Yeah. Very good. I didn't touch anything on diseases, folks, because we have the disease specialist here, Kelsey Anderson, and she's going to be teaching us a little bit on how to look for wheat disease and which diseases to look for.
Romulus?
Yes.
I've seen some fields that have pretty inconsistent emergence dates. I mean, like producers were getting the crop into moisture in areas that they didn't get in the field. My assumption is that you're wanting like a guesstimate on areas, because I mean, the wheat is in two different stages distinctly in those fields. My assumption is trying to grab some samples out of both areas and trying to do guesstimates to come up with something. What would your suggestion be to handle fields that you see like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that's happening a lot this year. I'm also seeing that like it's not uniform, right? It's like the fields are just not uniform sometimes because of that different amount of moisture at planting. Or what we usually do is each person in the car, let's say they were in 3 or 4, each one of us would do 3 or 4 points in the field, random, right? We're kind of throwing the stick, and whenever it falls, we'll go there. So maybe I think that would capture that, you know, and if that's the majority of the areas looking like that, we need to do the yield estimates on those fields as well. So that'll be my gut feeling is like we'll keep the protocol kind of normal because it should be random, right? If we're throwing it out in the air, it should be pretty random where it's falling. So if it falls in a small area, we'll do the calculations. I mean, we'll get those values. If it falls in a bigger area, we'll get those values at that time. Dave, have you been through that in the past? How did you guys handle that?
Well, you know, we try to do some common sense. Whatever it looks like you ought to do, we kind of encourage everybody to do. I'm not so sure that the stuff that's late isn't going to catch up. Intended the race to catch up quick. I think we just encourage everybody to just evaluate if it's a percentage, it's bad, then use that.
Yeah, no, good question. And any other questions? Maybe I guess I turn it over to you without even asking if there was any questions. But I'll be around here as well all evening. So, any other questions? Things that we didn't cover maybe before I get into the diseases?
Do y'all graze much in Kansas?
Okay, so if there's much grazing in Kansas, last time that I looked in a survey that was done was about 10 to 12%. So not anywhere near as much as you guys do in Oklahoma, 50-60% there. So there's a little bit, but overall, I don't think the dual purpose is as much. We'll see quite a bit of graze outfields in the end. Some of those that didn't have the potential, perhaps, and then growers would leave it grazing. But the last hard number that I looked at was about 12%.
Are you seeing much cut for hay right now? I guess it's not in hand yet, so I guess.
Yeah. I haven't seen much in the travels that I've been around these last couple of weeks. I haven't seen much. Good question. Yep. Well, I'll be around, folks, and I'll turn it over to Kelsey here.
Okay, great, thank you. So can you all hear me okay? I don't have as good of a projecting voice as Dr. Lovato, but I'll try. So it's good to see you all in person. So like Romulo mentioned, I just started a year ago, so I've had very few in-person things up until this past couple of weeks. So it's nice to actually see some faces that aren't in little Zoom boxes. So I'm going to talk about the diseases. People don't usually like to talk about the diseases until they happen, right? It's like kind of that thing you like to sweep under the rug because, you know, they can cause big problems. And here in Kansas, they do cause some pretty significant losses. So this is losses last year due to some of our top diseases just across the state of Kansas. So these are going to vary from field to field based on management practices and the weather, but these are our overall estimate of losses. And you'll see how they kind of shake out here. So our rusts are at the top, stripe rust and leaf rust. They make the plant look rusty, right? We also have Fusarium head blight, tan spot, and then one we'll talk a good amount today because it has been a big issue is wheat streak mosaic complex. So just looking at our top diseases, we estimate that across Kansas, they lost about 27 million bushels of wheat. So on any individual farm, maybe that's not a lot, but it adds up to a good amount. So you can probably see why we have a wheat pathologist here at K-State, because there's a lot of wheat and these diseases could be really important. So like I said, we'll just talk about some of the top ones here. I'm going to show you how to quickly identify them if you've never looked at some of these diseases. But feel free, I'll put my Twitter handle there too. If you see something funky when you're out on the tour, just shoot me a tweet or a message and I'd be happy to try to digitally diagnose it for you. So first is stripe rust. So this is one of the ones we've been seeing really hit hard this year. And that's because stripe rust really favors these cool, wet conditions we've been having lately. So this has been great wheat weather, but it's also been really great stripe rust weather, especially in this area that we're in, just right around Manhattan here and some of the counties moving west, and also in that southeast corner of the state. And I'll show that a little bit in a moment here. And so if you're seeing stripe rust out in the field, sometimes you'll see it if you move the canopy. If there's a dense canopy, you'll see it first on the lower leaves, and when it gets bad and when we get worried is when it's really up on those flag leaves. And it'll start out basically in stripes. So it gets its name from these classic stripes. It can't grow along the vein, across the veins of a wheat leaf, so it grows in stripes, and it has these really characteristic orange spores. And those, basically, if you run your finger across one of these stripe rust lesions, you'll be able to wipe the spores off. So they come off almost like rust, and they're pretty dramatic when you see them in the field. Most stripe rust that you'll see, hopefully, won't be much worse than this, because we have really good genetics out there in the field, and there are really good fungicides that producers are spraying. But in a really severe case, so this is a really susceptible variety, you can see stripe rust has pretty much taken down all of the leaves. So this is a pretty dramatic example of what you can get if you didn't have some background genetics and you didn't have a fungicide application. So that's what we would get out in the field with weather like this if we didn't have some of these tools.
And around the world, isn't that's the biggest disease in the world, right? For hundreds of years.
It's one of the top diseases in many wheat growing regions. It's called yellow rust in most parts of the world. We call it stripe rust, but that's the same issue. And breeders have been working really hard on this for a long time, but it just keeps beating them to the punch a little bit. And so you might see some interesting symptoms out in the field, some things that are stripe rust, but at different stages. We don't always see that perfect textbook striped lesion. So here you can see just, in some of our fungicide plots, this is an untreated leaf, so it's pretty bad. The flag leaf's pretty bad. We would expect a good amount of yield loss there. You can see all of those orange spores there, so you get nice and rusty, and my pants would get nice and orange when I walk through this field. And here's that same level of infection, but after a fungicide. So you would come and you would see all of the lesions, but they'd be empty, so they wouldn't have spores. So you might see things like that because a lot of fungicides have been going on lately, where you have the blocky lesions, but you don't actually have the spores. That could still have been stripe rust, but it's been controlled with a fungicide. You also might see the plant kicking in its background defenses here. It's hard to see maybe from this angle, but you can see there's little flecking on that leaf, and that's actually the plant's immune system kicking in. So you might see something like that while out on the tour, and that could be due to stripe rust. In this case, it is. These are all from similar plots. That one was treated with a fungicide in the same field. So a couple things about stripe rust. It starts, we think, mostly in Texas and some in Mexico, and then it kind of skips its way up across Oklahoma and into Kansas. So we watch what's going on in Texas and Oklahoma really closely to try to figure out when it's going to arrive here. So this year we started to get reports around April 16th. I'll show a couple of these maps, but here you can see in green there at that time where we had not observed stripe rust. Yellow is where we had seen stripe rust, but just on the lower leaves, so very early infections. And then they'll start to turn brown, and that's when we're starting to see them in the upper canopy. And that's a kind of a dangerous situation and potentially a signal for a fungicide application. White is where we just did not have reports or scouting efforts going on. So like I said, this skips up from Texas, and that size of that cloud of spores is really important. That dictates how many spores arrive here in Kansas. But then, like I mentioned, the weather, once those spores arrive, is really going to drive how much infection we have in the state. And the weather was really favorable. So again, we started to see those reports in late April. We started to see reports here right around Erie County at the end of April. And by April 29th, we've had reports all the way into central Kansas. By May 6th, so just a week later, we had reports on the Nebraska border and in several locations. It was starting to get very bad down in this southeast corner. And it's continued to get very bad there in untreated plots. This has been a particularly bad year in this region and also in this region of the state. And this is the situation as of this weekend. So you can see this has been a bad striped rust year. We have striped rust reported on upper leaves in central Kansas and in this south central region, also in the southeast, and we're starting to have reports in the northeast. And like I said, conditions look good, so we're getting lots of phone calls about striped rust risk. So striped rust is one you'll probably see out there on the tour, but there's another rust that we're thinking about. It has been a little less favorable for leaf rust over these past couple of weeks, but we have been getting reports of leaf rust. So striped rust really likes this cool, wet weather, the weather we've been having recently. Leaf rust likes the warmer weather. So that kind of picks up typically at the tail end of the season here in Kansas and can kind of be a yield biter right at the end. So leaf rust, you can really tell the difference because it's a darker rust, so it's more of a cinnamon color, a brown color, still rubs off if you run your finger along those spores. And it also produces more of a scatter shot across the leaves, so it's not limited by leaf veins. So you might run into leaf rust out on the tour, and the color is really the differentiator between those two. So those two are fungi, so fungal diseases that can be controlled with fungicides. But another one we've been seeing a lot of this year, unfortunately, is wheat streak mosaic virus. So wheat streak mosaic virus and its family of viruses cause this yellow and green streaking across the leaves. And it's actually a virus that's transmitted by this tiny mite that's almost impossible to see with your eyes, called the wheat curl mite. And that mite transmits when it bites. So kind of like a mosquito transmits malaria when it bites, this curl mite transmits the curl mite, these viruses, when it bites the wheat plant. And this will typically survive in volunteer wheat or other grassy species. So when the wheat dries down, those curl mites are looking for a home. They'll hop into volunteer wheat or some other grass species. They'll survive there until the next planting in the fall, and then they'll move to the crop. So we always recommend destroying volunteer wheat as soon as possible to prevent this disease. This year, we think it was higher than usual levels because there was a lot of moisture in that period when that volunteer wheat would be sprouting. So in that period, in that late summer period pre-planting, there was a lot of moisture and there was a lot of volunteer. So usually, in a lot of cases when we found bad wheat streak, we found volunteer. So if you find this out on the tour, there's probably a volunteer field or some other source that can be identified somewhere nearby. So again, just showing some different symptoms. There are a few viruses. We talk a lot about wheat streak mosaic virus, but it comes in a package that could potentially include other viruses that are all vectored by this tiny mite, and they all look pretty similar. So we have to take them into the diagnostic lab and do some testing to actually tell the difference between these viruses. But practically the management is pretty similar, except there are some varieties that are more resistant to some of the viruses than the others. These curl mites, they're pretty amazing. I'm gonna nerd out on their biology just for like a moment here, but they survive just a few days, right? 8 to 10 days, that's a pretty short window. That's why we can kill that volunteer for a couple weeks prior to planting, and it can pretty much control the population. But in that time, they lay a lot of eggs, like 12 to 20 eggs. So you can see how one could quickly become 1 million in a pretty short period of time if all of those are producing eggs. And then they can shower onto that new wheat crop and cause some real damage if they're not controlled. So like I said, we're probably seeing one of the worst years of wheat streak this year. So that's why I'm kind of drilling in on some of this wheat streak mosaic. Like I said, they're not just volunteer wheat's not the only problem when we're thinking about that alternative host or reservoir for these viruses or for the curl mites. There's also several other summer crops that can kind of silently host this virus, and then also some weed species. So something to just keep in mind.
Kelsey, on wheat streak is what was really different about it this year with your diagnostic lab. You're getting a lot more samples from areas that traditionally you wouldn't see wheat streak. Where traditionally when you talk about wheat streak, it's Southwest Kansas. Those guys aren't very good farmers.
When we talk about
it's pretty non-traditional for the reports that you're getting, and Romolo and Extension 8 have been reporting in South Central Kansas.
Yeah.
Has your lab shown that that is wheat streak and not triticum or one of the other viruses? And why would you think it's spreading from an area where you traditionally wouldn't see it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, that's the issue this year. So we expected in that western part of the state pretty routinely, but we've been getting, I mean, maybe 5 times the normal amount of samples into the diagnostic lab from that even central around Salina and west area, and then also down into central Kansas. We're digging into the reasons for that. I think some of it is weather. So we just had a lot of rainfall, and it seems like just some folks couldn't keep up with the volunteer, or volunteer escaped in a lot of ways. But to answer your question, yes, they are all positive, or the overwhelming majority of samples that we get are positive for actual wheat streak mosaic virus. There have been some that are positive for the other viruses as well, but they do have wheat streak mosaic virus. Yeah. Were there any other questions about?
How does the curl mite move? Is it the wind?
Yeah, it moves on the wind, so it can kind of catch the wind. It can kind of stand up on the wheat leaf, and then it's blown. So it can go, I think, up to 5 miles, but most will kind of disperse much closer than that. But it really just moves on the wind, so you'll see pretty dramatically kind of a wind direction downwind from that volunteer wheat or some other grassy host to the affected wheat field. You can tell which way the wind was blowing for sure.
So we normally would blame the farmer who doesn't kill his volunteer wheat every fall. So that would be who we normally blame. But now that the corn is out there so much, is the corn harboring this virus?
Corn is a host, yeah. So corn's a host. The worst yield loss you see is when the infection occurs after planting or in the fall. So I still think that the majority of the really bad yield loss is coming from those fall infections when corn potentially, well, it could be still in the field, could have been harvested already. But we still think the major source is from volunteer and not from corn.
Can CRP be a host?
What's that?
Can CRP be a host?
Oh, I don't know what is CRP.
Grass Conservation Reserve Program. Those grasses in that programs, can they be a host? I mean, can your taller grasses be a host for it?
Yeah, a lot of grasses can be a host. I'd have to look at the species specifically, but we pulled some weedy grasses out of a ditch nearby a really infected field, and all of them were positive for wheat streak mosaic. So I'm sure there's some species that wouldn't have wheat streak, but a majority of grasses are susceptible as a general rule.
Yeah, that's a good question there, Dave. We get it, a lot of comments of views that are biased here, that are pro-seed as well. So I think just wide variety of grasses, just like Kelsey mentioned there, would be harboring.
I try to save some integrity, so it's south of farm.
Appreciate that.
You're welcome, Jerry.
In charge of CRP.
I don't know.
Okay, well, I'm going to to another disease that you might run into. We see this more earlier in the season. It's called tan spot because it produces tan spots on the leaves. There's a couple other diseases that look pretty similar, but this is one that you'll really see in fields that are wheat after wheat typically. So this fungus survives on these little fruiting bodies in wheat straw after harvest. And then you'll see it, especially when it's wet early in the season, splash up into the lower canopy. And then if it's really wet, you'll see that start to move into the upper canopy and can cause yield loss. So you'll probably see less of this one, but it is a big problem, especially again in wet weather. These fungal diseases really like moisture. Here you can see it kind of moved into the upper canopy here. It's typically a tan triangular lesion, and you'll see some yellow around it typically. There are a couple other leaf spotting diseases, like I said, that look like this. There's Septoria triticide blotch. You'll see little black speckles in those spots. And then there's another one called Staganospora nodorum blotch. They're very hard to tell apart in the field. You typically have to take them into the lab to know for sure. The one you probably won't see, but is a big issue here in Kansas, is Fusarium head blight. You might, but it's a little early because this one really doesn't show up until around the soft dough stage. So we see the infection actually occurs during the flowering window, so right now. So this is actually really great weather for Fusarium head blight, and this is where we would be most worried and potentially apply a fungicide to protect that flower, because that's when the disease can occur. And like I said, it sneaks up on you, so you don't see it until a few weeks later, and it can cause pretty bad damage to grain. So this is a field that's probably pretty infected with Fusarium head blight, and you can see those bleached heads, those bleached spikelets. They produce grain that's what we call lightweight or tombstone. It's a little bit chalky in appearance. It can also cause this pink color in grain. And one of the worst things is that it produces a toxin called deoxynivalenol, which can be harmful to humans and livestock. It's sometimes called vomit toxin because it can produce that symptom. And it can cause discounts at elevators or some other definitely quality reduction. So a big one to manage, especially right now. So like I said, this is hot off the press. This is a risk map that's available at weedscab.psu.edu for across the United States. And this is really hot off the press. Our risk for weed scab just went up in some of the central Kansas counties, which is kind of corresponding to that flowering window. So we're at higher risk there and down here in some other parts of Kansas. So this is a tool that producers can look at to help guide that fungicide decision at flowering. So like I said, please feel free to reach out to me. I won't be actively on the tour, but I'll be on Twitter, and you can text me by phone if you run into any interesting symptoms that I'm sure that Dr. Lolato can do a great job at identifying, but if you run into anything particularly tricky, just please tag me in that. Oh, yeah.
The head blight and freeze damage kind of has some similarities in look. What is the best way to tell the difference?
Yeah, so for head blight, you'll typically see, I wish I had another picture in here, but it could start anywhere. So this spike could easily be confused with freeze damage, except the spikes are a lot smaller when there's freeze damage. So it kind of looks like it almost didn't fill properly, but that could be easily confused. Sometimes you can actually see a pinkish fungal growth on the outside of wheat that has head blight. But a lot of times it's really this kind of scattered dispersal of the infected spikes. So you'll see some infected in the field at the bottom, some are infected at the top, some start in the middle, just where that fungus entered. And when you see that kind of distributed through the field, that's more of that head blight look than that freeze damage look. Also, it's really the size of that. The spike doesn't really lose size with head blight damage, but it does with freeze damage. I don't know if that covered it or if there are other ways to tell the difference.
Can you generally see that when it's starting to fill or has filled pretty much?
Fusarium headlight. Yeah, so around probably the soft dough or a little bit earlier stage. So when it's completely filled. And
So I was gonna ask, you had a pretty high number for the 20 crop on fusarium. Where was that mostly? Southeast?
Southeast and central Kansas. So we ran into a good amount of headlight, even up into the north central part of the state. Yeah, like even around Clay County and then in that central Salina area. I wouldn't say it was the worst year for sure, but it was maybe around an average year.
Too much corn. Who said that?
I agree.
Yeah, too much corn.
Sure.
Okay, well, thank you. My contact information's here.
You can make it so it looks at you.
Feel free to reach out.
Okay. Thank you, Kelsey. Any questions for Kelsey and Ramla? We've got some more time here. If you've got any questions about what you might see out there the next few days, I think they did a very good job of covering that. The wheat streak you're going to see focused probably from around west central Kansas, Leote, Scott City, east to how far east have you seen it? Salina, Sedgwick County. So
I had a quick question. Without having seen today's crop progress, is crop falling behind? Is it later than April?
what the crop progress reports say, it's behind heading by about 10 percentage points. I think it's 58% headed as of today, and it should be 66, something like that. We've been saying about a week behind.
I think, yeah, about a week to 10 days is what a lot of people have been saying. It's a lot.
Like, what percent of the growers spray for scab?
Oh, that's a good question. And I don't know if I have a great answer. Yeah, I don't have a great answer.
She asked what percentage of the farmers spray for scab. It's very situational, and there's so many different products out there, and timing has to be very, very good, right, with the spray.
Yeah, so I think it's really dependent on the weather. So nobody would spray every year. I mean, there are producers that will spray probably every year. I've talked, but that would be a very, very small percentage of producers, and then it would be based on the weather.
The sprays that traditionally would control the rust don't necessarily control the scab. There are some that overlap a little bit, but that's part of the challenge.
With the fact that we're seeing higher grain prices, are we then in fact seeing farmers be more precise and more intensive in their management and what input they're willing to put into these crops this year?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think we are. More and more we have farmers that are interested in the management, especially of the fertility, because we're noticing that there's like a yield being left behind for proper fertility, and you see that through the protein concentration. If the farmer is harvesting grain less than 11.5, he's probably leaving yield behind. So there's been an increasing interest in that. In fungicides as well, I think we're seeing more usage of fungicides, sulfur that can affect yield and quality as well. We're seeing farmers being more proactive in putting those out. So I think with grain price, of course, they help. If it's $4 a bushel, then nobody's really very excited about investing. But yeah, with the higher grain prices, we're seeing more and more investment. Good question.
We do have some farmers here if anybody wants to speak up. Well, we'll have some farmers the next 2 nights too, and we'll have some input the next couple of nights on that.
Let's phrase it a different way. I think, Gary, that I've always argued that quality is better when prices are high. When the prices are high, people take care of their crop and they store it properly, they put the inputs on properly, and I think we're in the cycle where, at least for now, where it looks like people are gonna put the inputs in to make sure the protein's good, to make sure that the diseases are controlled, because it's worth it to the farmer.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Our biggest dilemma right now is I'm in the southwest part of the state, and we've got feed yards offering us 20 cents over the elevators a week to go to cows. What do you do if you're a farmer? Do you hold out and save it for a miller that by the time I pay my freight, I'm not going to make as much on it? Or do I go to the co-op and take 20 cents less? Or do I haul this high quality, nice looking stuff to a feedlot and get more money for it? It's a catch-22. I can't answer that. I can make up a story, but I can't.
Well, we're certainly proud of our wheat team from K-State, from the College of Ag. Romulo and Kelsey do a great job. They were out on the case a couple of weeks ago, playing detective on the disease situation, because there's a lot of different things that might be happening out there. And then there's the genetic side of it too. Research to develop new genetic traits to improve those wheat varieties. It's a constant battle with wheat. It's just very complicated. So, okay, Dave, do you want to talk about process and formula a little bit, or skip over that?
Well, we're going to use this. If the wheat isn't in the boot at least, we're going to use the early season formula, and it's very straightforward. It's kind of complicated. I'd say it this way, that the early season formula is a crop model, not a crop formula. And what I mean is that the NAS has gone back and looked at, if we have this many tillers at this stage of development, we're going to get this many bushels per acre. And it's based on past history. But that doesn't mean that's what's going to happen this year. So it's important to know that these models are kind of like, okay, this is what's happened over time. The late season formula is a little more accurate. And we like it because we're counting heads that won't be sloughed off, and you're measuring the head size. The only thing you don't know is, you know how many heads there are, you know the row width, you know how big the heads are, but you don't know how many kernels per head there's going to be. So typically we would enter, we hope you will enter, about 2.3 kernels per spikelet, because again, in the old days, Romulo, the average head size was 27 kernels. You know, so 10 by 2.3 was about the right size of a head for Kansas. So we use 2.3. So I encourage you tomorrow, when you're using the late season formula, count the heads, size the heads for the spikelets, and use 2.3 for your number, and that'll get us pretty close to what we need to know. Is that fair?
It is, yeah. And whenever you guys think of the wheat head, right, the fertility starts in the middle. A little bit about the middle, and then that's where the flowers start to be, well, pollinating and forming grains, and then it goes towards each side. So in the middle, it might have more than 2.3, but on both ends, we're going to have less. So on average, 2.3. That means that we're going to be producing 2.3 kernels in each one of those little spikelets.
The problem with the formula is we're always missing a little bit of the data. We'll know more in a week. We'll know more in 2 weeks. So the idea is, so what do we know now? We're going to know the row width. We're going to know how many heads per foot there are. We're going to know what the average size of those heads are. The only thing we don't know is how many kernels per spikelet are we going to have, and what's the test weight going to be. So if we all use 2.3, that'll get us through this problem and give us a pretty good idea of the yields, I think.
Page G4 tells you how to count the spikelets, and you'll all study this front to back tonight, but it's got a lot of good information on calculating your guess. It's got historical information, breakdown of acres by cropping district. So you can estimate how many acres per district times the yield based on what you saw that day. Or you can just do like me and use your phone number, whatever works for your prediction.
This will all make a lot more sense, for those of you who knew, this will all make a lot more sense tomorrow, because you're gonna see the field, you're gonna be making the counts, you're gonna be asking the questions, you're gonna be seeing what we're talking about, and it'll all make sense tomorrow night, I'm sure.
Would you use the 2.3 with those uneven fields that Jay was talking about?
Yes. Only because, so we don't know how many kernels per spikelet there's gonna be. And under great conditions, cool, high moisture conditions, it's gonna be better than 2.3. It'll be 2.5, it'll be 2.8. In the Pacific Northwest, it's 4.5. So I mean, it's possible to add a lot of kernels to this crop over time. But it's a guess to guess too high. It's more average to say, let's use 2.3, and if you think at the end of this tour that the conditions are gonna be perfect and you're gonna guess high, then guess high. Or if you think 2.3 is too high, then you need to guess low. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. I've always said that I used to look at corn crops in August, and you'd go through the field and you'd measure the row width, you'd measure the stalks, you'd measure the height, the length of the ear, you'd enter it into a formula, and it was spot on. It was exactly right as to what the corn crop would yield. You do that in a wheat field and you're wrong, because the environment is changing. The wheat crop is quick on its feet. It's changing to maximize the number of kernels that are going to be viable. So that's what the wheat crop is thinking. So this idea of when we're going out there and looking at this wheat field, we're looking at it's changing every day, responding to the environment. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Are there diseases? Are there not diseases? It's going to adapt and try to produce as many viable offspring as possible. Corn is very different. Corn is very easy to do a yield formula for. Wheat is different. So we're lucky this year that we're after the government estimate. We're after the heading stage. We're closer to knowing the final answer, but we're not going to know the final answer at the end of the story. We're going to make a guess as to whether we think it's going to get better or whether it's going to get worse.
Dave?
I'm babbling on, I know. Go ahead, Dave.
Or Romulo, that late season yield count there, what kind of seed count per bushel is that based on? I mean, is it 900,000?
60 pounds, it's based on 60
but like seed count, like 900,000, a million, 1.1, because that very size can, yeah.
I think there's a weight, part of the
Is
equation.
it a weight calculation in there?
Yeah, so part, if you see that 0.48,
I think it was.
yeah, that's a weight, so that's how we come to, per bushel.
Okay.
But again, it's important to know that the early season formula is a model. It's based on how over the last 10 years, the crop has looked on this day with this many tillers and this many row widths, how it's eventually come out. The crop formula, the late season formula, is more of a real number of how many, it doesn't estimate how many tillers are gonna die or slough off. It estimates how many of these heads are gonna be harvested, what the average size is, and what the kernels are gonna be. So it's the late season formula is a better number, but we still don't have all of the numbers. We don't have the kernel, we don't have the test weight, and we don't have the number of kernels per spikelet. But we've got a couple other better numbers.
I think it's a NAS uses like what Dave's saying, a 10-year average that they use for like a weight.
Okay. A few more housekeeping things. If you have any troubles the next few days, Dave's phone number is in the green book on page G1. My phone number is 785-410-4812. If you want to write that down or not. If you have any trouble or questions, I don't post fail. But if you have any other trouble, let us know. We talked about staying out of fenced fields. You might be approached by farmers on the tour if you haven't before. Most of them are just real friendly, want to ask what you're doing. If you're looking in their field, you can do them the courtesy of getting their cell number, calling them back later after you've calculated the yield down the road and let them know what you predict. But we typically don't have any trouble with that. So, Dave, you want to talk about drivers and driving and routes?
Yeah, I think everybody's got their, if anybody has any questions about where they're gonna go or what they're gonna do tomorrow or who they're gonna follow, let me know. But we think we've got everybody, you know, the flexibility to do what they wanted to do.